are. Welcome to our INFRA Plus Infrastructure for Fragmented Cities webinar series. My name is Dr. Dilyana Josifova, and I'm a senior lecturer in urban studies here at the University of Manchester, and I will be chairing this session today. Before I introduce our two speakers, I would like to briefly thank the GCRF and the University of Manchester for making it possible to hold this event series at all. INFRA Plus features colleagues who work on infrastructure, sustainability, and transitions around the world. Some of them I know very well and have the pleasure and honor to be working with as part of a portfolio of projects under the Sustainable Infrastructure umbrella. For instance, Professor Nanan Dong, who will be speaking next week, Professor Norma Valencio, or Professor Mita Bide. We work together on SASI and TOSIP, two projects which examine sustainable sanitation in China, India, and Brazil, using practice theories, transition theories, and scenario building and modeling. You can find out more about the projects on sasinfra.com. The overall aim of the INFRA Plus webinar series is to engage with thinking about infrastructure in the Global South, in East and Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, and in the Middle East. We have sessions tailored around these regions, bringing together theoretical and applied expertise and perspectives. In a parallel set of sessions, we will be hearing about different types of infrastructures and their governance and management, about their intersections with each other and with the domains of gender, age, and other markers of human identity. Speakers will also present just how development agendas across the world are related, how ideals and policies travel, and how they transform sustainability pathways. I should note that the webinars are decisively inter and transdisciplinary, with scholars from architecture, human geography, development studies, sustainability studies, and a whole range of other fields, as well as practitioners with hands-on expertise and in-depth knowledge of the challenges with which people on either side of infrastructure are faced in the Global South and beyond. INFRA Plus will be running over the next 15 or so weeks with almost weekly webinars. So if you have not done this yet, please do check out our other webinars as well. Please note that the webinar will be recorded. Recordings will be posted on the INFRA Plus and SASINFRA website. Attendees will be able to participate through the chat, so feel free, don't be shy. If you have questions, comments, do type them into the chat, and we will make every effort to invite the speakers to answer and comment following their presentations. And with that said, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Kathryn Furlong and Dr. Aditya Bahadur. Kathryn is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Montreal and Canada Research Chair in Water and Urbanization. She also acts as co-director of the Ethics and Environment section of the Center for Research on Ethics. Kathryn holds a doctorate in human geography, and her research focuses on the social and environmental consequences of political economic restructuring for water management and governance, particularly in the context of cities. Her research brings together the disciplines of economic and urban geography and political ecology, while addressing issues related to the provision of municipal services, socio-technical network, consumption, and the links between practice and ethics. Her brilliant recent work explores the economics and financialization of infrastructure. Today, she will be speaking about infrastructure and the SDGs and how financing models lead to overcapacity, debt, and disconnection. Dr. Aditya Bahadur is principal researcher in the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. Previously, he served as the Regional Program Development Manager with the DFID funded Action on Climate Today program based at Oxford Policy Management. He has 12 years of experience in research, evaluation, and practice of disaster risk reduction, climate change, and development. He has published widely on these issues, including in highly regarded academic journals. Aditya has an MA and a PhD in development studies from the Institute of Development Studies. He was research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute and is now an ODI research associate. Aditya completed his postdoctoral research at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he wrote a book on urbanization and resilience, which is going to be published shortly by Routledge. We will put a link to the book in the chat in a little bit. Today, he'll be speaking about disruptive resilience, an agenda for the new normal in cities of the Global South. So thank you very, very much to both Kathryn and Aditya for agreeing to speak today and launch INFRA+. It is a great delight and honor to have you here today. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Kathryn.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. So again, thanks very much, Diana, for the invitation, also for this very interesting set of webinars that you're organizing that will be really interesting to follow over the coming weeks. And so, as Diana said, I work at the University of Montreal in geography. My name is Kathryn, and the title of my presentation is Infrastructure and the Sustainable Development Goals, How Financing Models Lead to Overcapacity, Debt, and Disconnection. And so I just want to give the basic overview. So the story or the argument I want to make today basically centers around, I think, a story we all know pretty well. And this is the story of the commercialization of utilities, not only in the Global South, but in countries of the North, which was meant to solve a series of problems which were essentially very briefly described as government inefficiency, political capture, leading to excessive administration costs, especially around personnel, like an overemployment, underpricing of services, leading to underinvestment in infrastructure, and therefore poor quality services and an unwillingness to pay on the lack of users. And so this was the story of the so-called three lows. And this was going to be solved through utility commercialization throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with the ultimate goal being privatization, but commercialization being much more widespread. And so the idea of commercialization is that we're going to inject some business-like management into these utilities, going to operate more like businesses. We're going to reduce the administrative costs, increase the tariffs, improve the services, and people who don't have a problem, an inability to pay, but an unwillingness to pay, will therefore be willing to pay, and because the services would be better. And so this was the storyline, which led to widespread transitions in utility governance. And so what I want to do is shift the focus of that storyline from governance to financing. And so instead of talking about poor governance, to talk about, I would say, wealth extracting financial models, financing models, first debt-led development, and then financialization. And so to change the focus of the narrative where the problem comes from, and thereby help to hopefully open a discussion on different sorts of solutions. And so the talk will go as followed. I'll talk a little bit about external debt and how it actually engenders very high costs for utilities that actually came to dominate full cost recovery and are the base reason for full cost recovery rather than so-called governance failure. Then I'll talk a bit about commercialization and its relationship to these problems. And then the transition to financialization as a sort of measure to try to deal with these problems of unmanageable debts, which are in fact not a problem of utility governance, which was often, I guess, presumed or stated. So whereas debt in utilities became another sign of poor governance, debt is something that's very difficult to control because it's subject to interest rates and devaluation over which utilities have very little influence. And so, for example, in Colombia, so our case study then following the discussion of financialization will be Medellin. And in that context, where they faced significant devaluation since the 1950s, essentially, it can be from anything to changes in coffee prices to the war on drugs, or the end of the gold standard by the United States. So there's all kinds of external factors that lead to devaluation, which are obviously beyond the remit of even the best managed utilities. And so debts in this context become very difficult to manage and rise very quickly, the cost of servicing the debts. And so we'll conclude with a short discussion of some alternatives for rethinking financing. So that's what we're going to do today. So without further ado, so the external debt, so debt-led development, and how did this work, and how does it lead to rising costs in utilities that are not administrative costs or costs of debt? So this is the question. And so there's been a lot written on debt-led development. This is really not a new topic. And so just briefly, and these are certainly not the only people who've written on it, but it just gives a brief overview. And so in Bankruptcy of the Third World, Barbara Stallings goes through lending for building of infrastructure and other services in Latin America since the 19th century. And one of her major points is that whether it's chiefly by England in the 19th century, or England and the United States in the 1920s, or the World Bank after the Second World War, the process is generally very similar. So you have a lot of lending that eventually turns into a debt crisis, right? So these processes are they're repetitive. They're not confined to the post-war lending boom. They're processes that reoccur. And so this is the title of a recent book also on these processes called This Time It's Different, which of course it isn't. And so in encountering development, which is specifically on development lending in Latin America in the post-war period, one of the factors that Arturo Escobar underlines is that by the time you get to the late 1970s, early 1980s, Latin American countries are paying out 30 billion more a year in interest and fees than they're gaining in new lending. And so this is very important. This is the basis of what Cheryl Payer calls the debt trap. And so what she underscores, which I guess should be obvious to us all, is that the basic principle of a loan is that you pay back more than you receive, right? But so the idea with infrastructure lending was that infrastructure is supposed to be self-financing and revenue generating, and therefore you can make payments on these loans, right? If you manage your infrastructure well enough, and you're a good utility, then you'll make money on these infrastructures that will enable you to repay these debts. But of course, this is never really borne out in practice. And what you have are very high cost projects in locations where currency is considered what they call soft, so subject to devaluation. And the user base is very low income. So we have very unequal societies with very low income user base that can't necessarily, it's difficult to extract the payments from low income people. They just can't pay. And so what the debt trap is then is that debts are paid with new loans, right? So you end up in this cycle, what she calls a kind of Ponzi scheme, where in order to make payments on current debt, you need new debt. And so in the case that I've looked at in Medellin, a lot of payments, say over the course of a year, you make deficit payments with local loans from local banks, which are higher interest and shorter payback periods, but at least they're in your own currency. But you also deal with larger debts through the acquisition of new large infrastructure loans. So in order to get another big loan, say from the World Bank, you need another big infrastructure project. And part of this loan will be earmarked to pay down existing debt. So you're in a spiral of accruing debt to pay debt. And eventually, if lenders stop being willing to lend as they became in the 1980s, then you have what's called a debt crisis. But this is essentially how the system works. And so this is the debt trap. And so recently, this is the picture with the Swedish flag. It's a recent lecture, well, a couple of years ago now, by David Harvey at Uppsala University. And the point that he wants to make is that whereas we've talked a lot about, in studies of capitalism, talk a lot about capital, trying to raise capital, right? And what he says is today, increasingly, enterprises, individual, et cetera, you're actually trying to raise revenues to pay debts. So it's more about debt servicing than wealth creation. So this is sort of, I think, a transition he sees maybe after 2008. And so how does this relate to infrastructure specifically? Well, these are infrastructure loans. So most development lending was concentrated on the building of infrastructure. This, the woman here in the left hand, in the lower left, is Maria Mercedes Maldonado, who is a Colombian scholar and political figure. And so in a chapter in this book, Water, Present and Past, she makes the argument that international borrowing has two exclusionary effects on low-income users in cities in Colombia. And these are, the first one is that to get these loans, you need big projects. So big loans require big projects. That these projects are not geared towards meeting the infrastructure needs of low-income urban users, but that these projects need to be paid back through tariffs. So they lead to increases in tariffs, which leads to a double exclusion of low-income users in urban context because they can't afford the tariff. So what you get is disconnection, service suspension. And so just reflecting on what she's saying and like how widespread this is, say, beyond the Colombian or the Latin American case. So this graphic is from a paper by Bloomquist and Nelson on Kenya. And so what they point out, and they're trying to figure out partially in this paper, is a sort of discrepancy. So on the left part of the figure is supposed to represent kind of infrastructure in, say, Europe, North America, et cetera, where what they say is you have full vertical, what they call vertical integration upstream and downstream. And what that means is the infrastructure for generating electricity, capturing water, water transfers, all this kind of stuff is very well developed. And the consumption infrastructure also, the distribution infrastructure in cities is also, you know, completely vertically integrated is what they call it, but they mean, you know, accessible to everybody. And so in the Kenyan case, which is also true in the Colombian case, you have this complete vertical integration upstream. So you can manage to build really expensive, complicated infrastructure projects, chiefly in rural areas, right, to feed cities. But then downstream, you have what they would call, I guess, incomplete vertical integration. So the infrastructure for distribution and consumption is not, say, fully integrated. And so this problem is generally looked at as a problem, perhaps of governance, financing to the extent that you might have insufficient financing. But I would argue in this context and reflecting on what Maldonado has said, is that this is also a problem of the debt relation, okay? And so these problems of exclusion through large borrowing that she talks about. So where it's geared towards big infrastructure projects that don't meet the needs of low-income users and lead to a sort of double exclusion. So I think this is partly explains this kind of phenomena that they identify. And so in this context, I think, you know, infrastructure is often thought of as a contradiction, right, between invisibility and spectacle, for example. And so I think a major contradiction in infrastructure that is a both and, not an either or. It's a simultaneous process of social inclusion and wealth extraction. And the dynamic is, I would say, not a switch from one to the other, but like a constant struggle to prevent wealth extraction from overwhelming the effect of social inclusion. And so, for example, infrastructure is very much related to economic development, but which also means debt, as we've just seen, right? This economic development and the development of infrastructure services enable greater social inclusion, but also through the debt relation, there's wealth extraction. And so this ideology of infrastructure then is a future perfect, which is many scholars, particularly in anthropology, are thinking about that today, these ideals of infrastructure and what it's meant to bring in the future can, through this double nature of infrastructure, turn to crisis, you know? So economic crisis, management crisis, and what you see is actually infrastructure decay through a lack of maintenance as wealth is extracted from it through a lack of investment or financial mechanisms, as we'll see. So commercialization, and it comes into this context, which I've sort of already summarized a bit, right? So this idea that this problem of utilities that are unable, for a variety of reasons, to provide adequate services for the whole of their population is read not as a problem of debt, which I've presented in this case, but as a problem more strictly of governance, right? Inefficiency, poor management, government capture. And so this commercial model has two major features. One is utility autonomy from government. So these utilities have to be autonomous, and full cost recovery. And so what I'll show through the case study of Medellin is that this full cost recovery is actually focused on debt recovery. So one of the things that Laura Baer says in her study of financialization of debt on the Hooghly River, their navigation infrastructure, is that many of the things we consider neoliberal are actually about debt. So neoliberalism becomes an ideology that actually sort of becomes a kind of smokescreen for the actual purpose, which is not a critique of the relation between government and the market, but actually an effort to recover debt, right? And this becomes very obvious, say, for example, in the case of structural adjustment. So these policies of austerity are actually largely debt collection mechanisms. And so this is what I would say a full cost recovery, and it's very clear in the Medellin case. And so what this does then is, I argue, it leads to a transition in utilities of governing by debt. And so governing by debt, this is following Maurizio Lazzarato. And what he argues is that increasingly, he talks about the indebted man. So he's very much focused on the individual and how becoming indebted, which is increasingly a condition of many people across both the North and the South, is that your life becomes managed or governed in function of paying that debt, right? And so it's always lived in the future of paying this debt. And so where I live, like what kind of housing I can have, what kind of job I'm going to take, how many hours I'm going to work, what kinds of activities I might be able to do in the free time if I have any, this is all decided around eventually paying this debt. And so what you see, at least in the utility that I work on, IPMA in Medellin, is that this is what happens to the utility by the end of the 1970s. So through pressures, actually overt pressures by the World Bank in the 1970s, so to actually enforce the utility to raise tariffs in this decade in order to explicitly service debts that they've acquired. They want tariff increases of as much as 35% in a given year, and that there'd be monthly compounded increases. And in order to get the utility to do this, they actually stop payment on loans. And at this point, loans are 60% of the income of the utility. So then they have to conform, right? And so this governance of the utility becomes, your relationship with users, et cetera, becomes focused around actually paying this debt, servicing it. I think servicing is a very good word, right, in relation to debt. And so I argue that this governing by debt can be thought of also in terms of utilities and not just individuals in the case of Lazzarato. And so then what happens when we get to the 1990s? We've had our big debt crisis of the 1980s. And so what starts to change, right? And so especially with the 1995 debt crisis in Mexico, governments in southern countries start to look to financialization as a way to deal with debt, okay? And so what they're trying to do here is to actually avoid the IMF package of restructuring by trying to sort of finagle their way around the debt problem through different kinds of financial instruments. And we'll get to that a bit later. And so one author talks about how, because a lot of the research on financialization is focused on the global North, we tend to talk about financialization of the economy, of individual life, of corporations, et cetera. Whereas the financialization of the state, particularly of government debt, is actually a really important phenomena, particularly in countries of the global South, and precisely as a pragmatic effort to sort of avoid economic restructuring by organizations like the IMF. So we'll get to that. So there's most of the most of the literature too on financialization as it relates to infrastructure talks about infrastructure as an asset class. Okay, and so this is where you'll invest in infrastructure and then draw out gains from those investments, right? And so this can be done through equity or debt. So equity, you become part owner in a corporation or of the asset. A debt, you invest in it financially. This is often done through pension funds, different kinds of financial groupings or actors. And one of the things that Clark emphasizes in his study of what he calls pension fund capitalism is that infrastructure is actually a pretty risky investment. Like, it's very long term, technologies can change, et cetera. And so these investments, what the government does is try to engage with investors to make them lower and lower risk. So to have guarantees on these kinds of investments in order to get these investments. And so one thing that's talked about then is users becoming a kind of human revenue stream, because like with debt, you have to extract the payments for these investments from the user base, right? But one of the things that Ashton also points out is that in financialization, it's not just tariffs that should involve a return, but also things like debt swaps and different mechanisms of trading the debt once it's been invested in that financial investors can use. And so in that case, it becomes more difficult then also to negotiate for debt refinancialization or extension when things get difficult. So continuing, some of the things that people have found then in related to this treatment of infrastructure as an asset class is, as I've said, it's driven by government. So this is also an idea of neoliberalism and austerity. So in a context, and so this is a picture of the desalination plant actually in London, so not too far from our hosts. But the idea is that under austerity, governments don't feel that they can justify investing government money in infrastructure, but infrastructure is necessary for economic development, to attract corporations, all this kind of stuff to cities. And so they try to get the financial sector to do it. But as I just said, this requires a lot of concessions to generate interest. And it also focuses investments on particular kinds of infrastructure. So like desalination plants, toll roads, where investors see a return on investment that'll be more rapid. So a lot of necessary infrastructure will not be financed through this mechanism, and also that it's geographically limited. So it's pretty much Australia, England, the United States, but very little in the global south. And even in England, it's not as great as the government might like. And so when we think about then financialization in the context of the global south, one of the most important mechanisms, as I just said, is the financialization, what they call the state, so a public sector debt. So in her study of the navigation infrastructure along the Hooghly River, what Laura Baer underscores is that the increasing costs of debt are used to justify austerity. And this becomes a way also to extract wealth from infrastructure. So that you use this money then to pay debts instead of finance infrastructure or to repair it, leading to these infrastructure of austerity, which become increasingly dangerous. And at the same time, this government debt is being traded on different kinds of markets. And so it's being controlled more by technocrats and investors that then you would have to negotiate, as opposed to kind of a one financial organization. And so this financial of public debt, I have this image of the water crisis in Detroit, just to say that it also really affects low-income cities in the global north, right? But we'll see it now in the case of Medellin. And so the idea is that you try to hedge on devaluation by purchasing American dollars, right? So they're called, the case in Colombia, dollar peso swaps, right? And this allows you, by hoarding these US dollars, it allows you to hedge against the effects of devaluation. And so it's most prevalent in southern economies. It still involves, research finds, massive transfers of wealth north from southern countries that will eventually be individualized through mechanisms like full cost recovery. So this collective debt that we hold, say, as citizens of a country, is actually distributed individually, right, to individual service users, individual taxpayers, right? So it may be held collectively, but it's paid individually. And so it's a kind of a, in Margaret Atwood's book, Debt and the Shadow Side of Wealth, she has this kind of quip where she looks to turn trickle down economics on its head, right? And so she emphasizes the trickle in trickle down, underscoring the fact that even for proponents of trickle down economics, they don't expect the transition of transfer of wealth to be, well, it's going to be minimal, it's going to be a trickle. And turning that on its head, she talks about debts that they also trickle down to individuals in society, where their impacts can actually be very significant. And so this is what we'll see a little later on. So this is the case of Medellin. So this is where it'll all become hopefully more concrete. Oops, sorry. So just starting with Colombia, which is obviously where Medellin is located. So it's the second largest city in Colombia. We see on the map the capital Bogota, Medellin, a little to the west. And what's interesting about Colombia for this kind of study is that both in the 1920s with the Kemmerer missions, and then again in the late 1940s with the first World Bank mission, so that's Lachlan Curry at the bottom, Colombia was sort of the first port of call. So this is where American representatives landed to start to generate banking reforms in Latin America in order to enable lending for their banks to Latin America that they would consider safe so that they could recover payment, because the importance of lending is that you're going to make a profit on it, right? And so Colombia in both instances was sort of the pilot for these kinds of things. So the first country study by the World Bank was done in Colombia in 1948. So this is the guy down on the bottom that did it. And in this context too, what makes Colombia interesting is that it's like always been considered sort of the good student kind of the development banks. So it hasn't had hyperinflation like some other countries. It didn't have a debt crisis in the 1980s in the sense that it didn't default, right? It was the last to default after the economic crash in 1929 as well. And so it's sort of been the good student of the development banks. And this is even more true of the multi-utility, the Empresas Públicas de Medellín in Medellin, so EPM for short, who delivers water, electricity, and gas, and for a long time also telecom. And so this is the city of Medellin down at the bottom. And what we see is very much the dynamic identified by Bloomquist and Nielsen, where you have this, unbelievable upstream vertical integration in their words. So you have this whole huge network of dams you see here on the upper right in the regions surrounding Medellin that has been developed by this enterprise. And at the same time, and so they're producing 50% of the electricity for all of Colombia. And then at the same time, and they would like to produce more. And at the same time, you have people cooking on open fires on the outskirts of the city, right? And so, and it's not because there's not an electricity wire running by, it's because they've been cut off for user debt to the utility. So this is also how this debt kind of trickles down, right? The utility is indebted to the banks and the users become indebted to the utility. And so devaluation is a huge part of this story. So EPM gets its first loan in 1960 for infrastructure for a water project. And already a year later, they're scrambling to make payments. And a key reason is devaluation. And so in green, we see the mean value of the peso relative to the US dollar until 2004. And because the devaluation is so dramatic from the 1980s forward, it looks like they're not really experiencing devaluation from 1960 to 1980. But in the blue line shows that it's upwards of 650% in those years. So you have large increases in what you have to pay on the debt simply because of devaluation year on year. And so already after getting their first loan, they're already in the cycle of the debt trap where they're looking for another loan to make payments on the original loan. And this will continue. And one of those projects was actually an energy project. And so in this graph, what I want to show, so we can read this in two moments. The first one from 1960 to 2000, and then from 2000 to roughly the present, so it's after 2013. And so in the first part of the graph, what we see is for 24 of the 29 years for which there's data for both values, that devaluation either is equivalent to or exceeds by a significant margin the increase in the long-term debt. So the increase in the long-term debt is really driven in these years by devaluation, not to even talk about interest. And so what happens around 99, 2000 is they start to look for different ways to deal with debt so that devaluation is less of a problem, right? And so in 1998, they do their first bond issue in 20 years. So to sell bonds on international markets in order to raise revenues. This is also a form of debt, but different in nature. And then the other thing they do is they start to engage in 2000 in peso dollar swaps. And so this is what we're talking about. This is the financialization of government debt. So you accumulate dollars in order to hedge against devaluation. And what you see is in 2004, so it really does work, the effect of devaluation goes negative for the first time since borrowing started, okay? And so it does work, but at the same time, what we see is that, so the brown line is the cumulative liabilities and derivative instruments. And so by 2013, where the graph ends, they've accumulated 800 million US dollars in liabilities or debts through these peso dollar swaps, right? And so what some analysts say is it becomes a way of, well, what you have is you have large sums of money that are held, right? And so they're not invested in infrastructure or social development, but they're held for these purposes. So it becomes, you know, a negative for improving social inclusion. But also it incurs heavy liabilities, right? So you're still transferring wealth out of the country, but you're not in a debt crisis because you're managing somehow devaluation. And so this is the relationship in this graph, the relationship between fees and administrative costs and the cost of debt, right? And so in the story that we've been told that I narrated at the beginning, administrative costs are what are driving up the cost of utility for utilities, and that these need to be gotten under control, right? So nobody ever mentions the cost of debt. It's the cost, you know, poor administration, poor governance, all this kind of stuff. And so in this graph, operational income is basically a proxy for tariffs, right? All the tariffs you've collected. We see the operational income in the solid black. Administrative expenditures are in the light blue columns, right? And so we can see they're relatively steady over the period, right? But in the 1990s, the devaluation and interest on the long-term debt far exceeds by orders of magnitude the costs, administrative costs, right? So by far and away, your greatest cost that's contributing to your increases in tariffs is the cost of paying your debt, right? And we're not even talking about principal. And so then we can also read this in two moments, up to 2000 and after 2000. So what happens in 1999? Because what we see is a dramatic increase of tariffs at the end of the 1990s that goes on until the present, right? And so where does this come from, right? So what's happened then in 1999 is the utility decides to put in activity-based costing, ABC accounting. And ABC accounting originates in the United States as a corporate kind of accounting strategy in the 1980s and 1990s. And the idea is that what you're going to do is spread all of the costs, like administrative costs, all these kinds of things, across all of an enterprise's so-called products, right? So instead of just the direct cost of producing the product, you're going to take all the costs of running the enterprise and spread them across the products, and it becomes a way of eliminating products or raising prices or laying off workers. by then seeing what products really kind of cost, right? And so when you apply these to utilities, obviously you can't eliminate products because your products are energy and water, right? But what it does justify are dramatic tariff increases. And so this is what we see, a significant jump then from 1998 to 1999 when it's first applied, and then increasing forward after the period. And so what is the impact on users for this? The impact on users is increasing debts for utility services, debts to the utility, and service cutoff. And so in this graph, so you see debt for services starting to increase dramatically in the 1970s, and in the utility reports, they will tie this directly to their increases in tariffs, which of course are tied directly to their increase in debts. And then what we start to see after 2000 as well is the increase in accounts in arrears. And so these are people that have not been able to pay for 3 months or more, and therefore are subject to service suspension. And what we see too is this just increasing levels of indebtment on the part of users to the utility. So our debt gets transferred down and spread out throughout the population, but only a certain portion of the population. And so for the years in which there is still data, because they published data on disconnections until 2011. And so between 2007 and 2011, there were 850,000 experiences of disconnection in the city. 90% of those were residential, and 95% of those were in the lowest income neighborhoods. So this is a bit of a graph of the distribution between energy, water, and gas for cutoffs. And so one of the things that I was often told when I did interviews in the utilities in the EPMA was that, you know, our users love us so much that they'll go without food to pay their utility bills. So it's considered a sign of love for the company or the utility. In work done by Velasquez with what he calls barrio women, so women trying to make ends meet in some of these low-income communities in Medellin, is that actually they don't see going without food as a gift to the utility at all or a sign of loyalty, but actually as a very violent choice that they have to make. And so this is a quote from City Councilor Luis Carlos Diaz Mora from 1996 at one of the council meetings in Medellin, which I think sort of sums up the situation. So he says, current child malnutrition among marginalized populations does not come from nowhere. Salaries have degraded with the increase in unemployment. We are paying the cost of the external debt at the cost of creating a social debt. We know the difficulties created by the high cost of public services. There are statistics that show that the use of wood burning has increased because they cannot pay the services. Violent convulsions are born of mistaken models of development like we have here. And so he was not the only one to worry at the time that this kind of exclusion that these utility fees were leading to could also lead to violence in the city. And so what could be some alternative ways of thinking through financing for infrastructure? If we start to think of problems that utilities might frequently have in the global south, not necessarily as governance problems, and we're not saying there aren't any governance problems, but to think of them as problems of financing, problems generated through the debt relation and through financialization. So if we can think of those problems, then our solutions also, that is kind of the origin or a big part of the origin of the problem, then we have to rethink our solutions. Our solutions don't become about punitive governance reforms, but more about thinking about how services are financed and changing those models. So what could be some options? And I'll preface this final part of the presentation by emphasizing that unfortunately I don't really have answers, but I have some I guess we'd say in French, piste, like I don't know, pathways, I guess, for thinking about it. And so this person in the picture is Carol B. Winner, and she wrote an essay in this book representing class called The Promise of Finance. And in that essay, what she argues is that we need to rethink productive investment beyond exchange value to include use value. And so what happens now, like when we think about that desalination plant in London or toll roads, right, that very few people can actually drive on because they're too expensive. When we in the financialized investment infrastructure development model, what you get are really big infrastructures, right? So you get a certain kind of infrastructure because it's based on exchange value. So the return on investment has to be a monetary capital return, right? But if your return on investment is actually about use value, or at least includes it, then you're talking about social and environmental improvements, inclusion. So your investments could be in social housing, in environmental mitigation, and these kinds of things. And so your use value is more about, your use value, I would say, leads to a different kind of infrastructure development in this case, right? So if we're thinking about use value, we're probably not talking about a toll road, right? If this becomes a big factor in deciding what and how we're going to finance. And so then rethinking what is a productive investment towards use value also means we change the things we invest in, and then we can also change how we invest, right? So they come together. And so what are some potential examples? So for example, Kathryn and Christopher's in one of their articles where they're thinking about financing for green infrastructure and how that could happen. So one of the examples they draw on is this US interwar rural electrification program. So where the federal government gave low interest loans to entire communities to build out energy infrastructure into rural areas. And so this is kind of community lending type of thing. And this is actually one of the things they've been doing in Colombia since the 1960s to extend infrastructure to neighborhoods that have been recently legalized, right? So that weren't included in the municipal periphery and now are. And so one of the mechanisms they call it habilitación de viviendas is to provide these low interest loans to the entire community to help build out infrastructure that's collected on the tariffs for that infrastructure partially over time in small installments. David McDonald and some of his colleagues work a lot now on public banks. And so their idea is that public banks have more flexibility for different kinds of lending that might include ideas of social investment, use value. And one of the banks that they underscore is this Dutch, it's called the Nederlands Waterschap Bank. Anyway, so it's the Netherlands Water Bank. And so the Netherlands Water Bank raises capital in international markets and through the sale of sustainability bonds. And with this money, they provide low-cost loans to public utilities in the Netherlands for projects like cooperative housing, flood control, climate change mitigation, et cetera. And so while none of these examples fully respond to the kinds of things that B. Wiener is talking about, they sort of take steps in that direction where you can look towards loans that are low or no interest, that have very long payback periods and are for other types of infrastructure projects, right? So when you don't have to make this return on investment to financial investors, then you can think about some of the things that Maldonado, the woman, the scholar from Columbia that we heard from earlier, talked about. Like, we're not investing in leak detection and repair, right? Small infrastructures for communities that sort of have narrow spaces and stuff like this. So to think also about alternative water sources, rainwater harvesting, all these kinds of things where finance capital isn't, or even large infrastructure debt, right, from a foreign bank is not going to pay for these things, right? But if we think about productive investment in a different way, then we can think about different levels of investment for different kinds of projects and different kinds of return. And so on that note, I'd like to conclude the presentation and thank you all very much for this opportunity to share some of these things with you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very, very much, Kathryn, for this fascinating and slightly mind-blowing presentation that raises lots and lots of questions. at least in my head. Before we move on to Aditya, let me just briefly remind the audience, please, if you have comments or questions, do type them into the chat box. I think I will attempt at the end of the session to actually let everyone speak, so that it's not that I will be reading out questions, but just make sure to indicate that you have one, and then we can bring you up to discuss this with the speakers. So thank you, Kathryn, and we will be back with questions after Aditya's presentation. Aditya, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, Deliana. I'm really grateful to the University of Manchester and you for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen, and a thumbs up from Deliana, you to tell me whether all is okay would be great.
Yep.
I don't.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Yep, the green thing with disruptive risk, disruptive. Okay, perfect. So I think in a nutshell, what I'm going to speak about over the next 20 to 30 minutes is the idea of, it pertains to the whole discourse on urban resilience. My thesis is simple. I'm going to demonstrate that the kind of risks that cities and infrasystems within cities are facing are shifting. And therefore, ways of building resilience in cities also need to change. Fairly straightforward idea. Now, and this has been framed in terms of looking at the idea of disruptive risk, that is new kinds of risk that cities are facing, and disruptive resilience, new ways of enhancing resilience. So what do I mean when I say disruptive risk? There are a few components to this idea. The first is that outlier events are on the rise. And this means a few different things. There was a special report from the IPCC a few years ago that demonstrated that a number of hydrometeorological extreme events are on the rise. And this can be seen in a number of different climate impacts. For instance, there is likely to be a 300% rise in extremely hot days in the United States over the course of this century. Over the last 50 years, there's been a 300% rise in extreme rainfall events in India. Overall, there seems to be now agreement on the fact that past historical patterns of risk can no longer be used to understand the future perfectly. And there is no better demonstration of this than the disaster that happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. Of course, what happened there was due to a large number of factors. There were big social problems, there were big failures of governance, but one of the components that contributed to the disaster was infrastructure, and specifically the fact that flood protective infrastructure around New Orleans was built to withstand a storm that happens 1 every 100 years. But Hurricane Katrina was a 1 in 400-year event that led to catastrophic failures of infrastructural systems. And this was because the infrastructural system had been designed looking at past patterns of risk, not accounting for black swan events that might occur. Now, of course, we're all living in the time of COVID-19, and this argument is more pertinent now than ever before. Statistically, there's about a 1% chance of a pandemic like COVID-19 happening in any given year. But there is also growing consensus on the fact that due to the density of social networks, global financial systems, the likelihood of these pandemics happening in the future is going to increase. So overall, there is an increase in outlier and extreme events of all sorts happening around the world. The second component of disruptive risk is risk that is happening at a large scale. And this is because different kinds of hazards are taking place simultaneously. I think most countries are geared to withstand a disaster happening in a particular places at the same time. But through COVID-19, we've seen in large countries like India, Brazil, United States, every single city, every single province or state has been battling this together. But also it's important to remember that extended crises like pandemics also means that biological disasters and hydrometeorological disasters are starting to take place concurrently. There are a few really poignant examples of this. One comes from the eastern seaboard of India and the southern coast of Bangladesh, where Cyclone Amphan took place last year. Now, one of the states in India that was impacted was Odisha. As some of you would know, Odisha has traditionally been impacted by cyclones, and over the last couple of decades has made major strides in reducing the risk from cyclones. And this is because of a number of reasons, including the development of cyclone shelters along the coast that have played a very important role in reducing risk. Now, when Cyclone Amphan hit, 1/4 of all the cyclone shelters in the state were being used as COVID-19 isolation centers, spreading resources thin. I think another poignant example was the ammonium nitrate explosion that happened in Beirut last summer. All of you would remember the horrific videos that went viral on social media. What was less discussed was that 24 hours after this blast, Beirut recorded the single highest number of COVID-19 infections in the city up to that point. So we're seeing that these crises are reverberating against each other and becoming more complex and more compound. And therefore, it's not surprising that the International Red Cross has come up with a piece of research recently that has determined empirically that 92 extreme events that have impacted 52 million people have taken place at the same time as the same group of people were battling COVID-19. And of course, this is important to our discussion here because 90% of all mortality and morbidity from COVID-19 has taken place in urban centers. The third component of disruptive risks is the fact that risk is becoming more and more difficult to anticipate. And of course, this is one of the reasons for this is because there are outlier risks that we talked about a minute ago. But another contributing factor to this is the growth in teleconnected and transboundary risk, which is just a fancy way of saying that a hazard in one part of the world leads to disruptions and disasters in another part of the world. Again, I'll give you a few examples of this. In 2011, tropical storm Knock-10 impacted certain parts of Thailand. While there was direct loss of livelihoods and assets in where the storm made landfall, this had major global impacts across the world. This was because the place in Thailand where the storm made landfall was also the car production center of the country, which is producing parts that were used in car supply chains across the world. And therefore, this one event in one part of Thailand led to disruptions to car supply chains in Brazil, in Vietnam, Philippines, India, Pakistan. And of course, this had downstream impacts on people's livelihoods and local economies. Example number 2. Coincidentally, in the same year, there was an extreme heat event in a part of Arizona. This extreme heat event led to a surge in demand for energy. This led to an electricity cable tripping. This in turn led to grid failures in Arizona that cascaded through the western seaboard of the United States and extended into Mexico. So one extreme heat event in one small part of Arizona led to grid failures across North America. This in turn had downstream impacts on water supply and sewage management systems. So again, geographically non-contiguous areas are experiencing disasters because they're connected through other infrastructural systems. COVID-19 also is disrupting all kinds of supply chains across the world. There's emerging insights on how pharmaceutical supply chains and textile supply chains are particularly badly disrupted. But the true impact of COVID-19 on how it's going to have an impact around the world is still being studied. Now, all these kinds of disruptive risks are rendering existing systems redundant. We've all heard the stories about health and emergency response systems being overburdened. First, there was a lack of ventilators and then a lack of ICU beds. But more fundamental weaknesses in risk management systems across the world are only now coming to light. I'll give you one small illustration from my own country, India, where I read a really interesting commentary that explored how India's Disaster Management Act that was launched with much fanfare in 2005 after the tsunami and is a watershed moment in the disaster risk policy history of our country, fails to adequately classify what a disaster is. As a result of that, during COVID-19, it wasn't disaster management agencies that were best placed to respond to a crisis like COVID-19 that were in the front line of the battle against the pandemic. It was a range of other less capable institutions. And I feel these kinds of fundamental weaknesses are going to come to light more and more. Now, this is a conference that focused on urban, sorry, I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, this is a conference that is focused on urban areas. You might ask me, okay, all that's great. But what is, isn't that applicable to urban and non-urban areas alike? I would posit that there are specific characteristics of urban areas that make this discussion particularly poignant for cities. I argue that cities have certain characteristics. Simply put, cities are more complex, dense, dynamic, and diverse than non-urban areas. They're complex because there are a number of governmental and non-governmental agencies, organizations, institutions, all working with overlapping mandates. They're highly dense simply because a more number of people live in a smaller amount of area in cities as compared to rural areas. They're dynamic because there's fast movements of goods, peoples, and ideas going in and out of cities. The urban metabolism is fundamentally dynamic. And they're diverse because people from different castes, classes, ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, all inhabit geographically contiguous areas. Now, these characteristics of urban areas pose particular challenges and put cities in the eye of the storm when it comes to disruptive risks. Complexity means that there is a high transaction cost between different actors and agencies trying to manage risk. Density means that risk can spread faster. Good example of this is New York City, where from a handful of cases of COVID-19 at the end of January in last year, when I was based there doing my postdoc, as Deliana said in the introduction, by April, the entire city had come to a standstill. So risk spreads really fast. The fact that cities are dynamic leads to a high exposure to risk. I mean, the fact that 90% of mortality and morbidity from COVID-19 has been in cities is a result of this dynamic exchange of goods and services in and out of cities. And the fact that cities are diverse means that there can be challenges in securing compliance with risk reduction protocols that are predicated on behavior change, like lockdowns. At the same time, these very characteristics of cities also provide certain opportunities for cities to effectively deal with risk if the power of cities is harnessed. So the fact that there are a large number of governmental and non-governmental institutions means that there is capacity in cities, and that can be used for managing risk effectively. The fact that large numbers of people are living closely packed together means that you can target the most vulnerable people more effectively. The fact that there are high movements of goods and peoples and ideas going in and out of cities means that there is a high innovation potential of cities. Let's not forget that 90% of all universities, research centers, think tanks, innovation labs in the world are concentrated in cities. And of course, the fact that different kinds of people who've had different experiences and come from different backgrounds means that you could surface solutions more effectively in cities. So therefore, when it comes to disruptive risks, yes, cities have particular challenges, but there are also particular opportunities that we can harness for dealing with these risks. So all this leads to the fact, that the nature of risk is changing, and therefore risk management approaches need to align with these shifts in risks. The concept of resilience, with its emphasis on flexible systems, modular systems that fail in a safe way, are more important than ever. But changes in methods and approaches and practices for building the resilience of urban centers is needed. And therefore, our argument rests on shifts in 5 strategic areas of action for ensuring that cities can deal with these disruptive risks. And these are the 5 areas that I'm going to talk about a bit more in detail in a second. First, we need shifts in data, kind of data that is used for planning a response to these disruptive risks. We need shifts in the ways in which vulnerable and poor population engage in decision making. We need new modes of financing that are flexible and innovative to deal with these new kinds of risks that cities are facing. We need to ensure that services and systems, water, transport, energy, health, are able to withstand these kinds of shocks and stresses that we've talked about a minute ago. And we need new innovative responses to deal with these new kinds of risks that cities are facing. I'll go into each of these a bit more in detail now. What I'm going to do is take each of these 5 strategic areas of action, talk about urban development as usual, then talk about how they've been explored in traditional approaches to build urban resilience, to really argue what we are talking about here is slightly different. So the first one is around embracing informality. Let's not forget the fact that 1 in every 3 people who live in a city across the world lives in an informal settlement. In certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, this percentage goes up to 60 to 70%. So a large part of the world's riskiest urban contexts are informal. And therefore, without meaningful engagement with the informal sector, which includes those living in informal settlements or working in the informal economy, we cannot make substantial gains for urban resilience. When it comes to urban development as usual, these people have been overlooked, ignored, outlawed. They've been seen as part of the problem. The traditional approach has been to evict them from informal settlements, demolish these settlements, and resettle them elsewhere. Now, when it comes to urban resilience as usual, now, by this, I mean big development programs funded by bilateral institutions or philanthropic actors. Yes, they've certainly engaged with the informal sector, but this engagement has been limited to soliciting their participation in processes whose direction has already been set. The poor and vulnerable people who are on the front lines of the battle against climate impacts or these different kinds of risks that we've talked about rarely have a role in framing the problem and driving the solutions. Largely, the relationship with them has been paternalistic, where they've been seen as recipients or beneficiaries of assistance that has been provided in cities of the global south. Now, what we're arguing for here is slightly different. It's more than just a value-driven agenda of saying that vulnerable people who are the receiving end of these programs need to have a say in them. We're saying that we need to develop local institutions in a spirit of meaningful partnership and come up with new governance arrangements where these people can drive solutions. And really interesting for me has been things that have happened during COVID-19. I'll give you a quick example from Dharavi. Many of you would know that Dharavi is the biggest slum in Bombay and in Mumbai, and by all accounts, one of the largest slums in Asia, and one of the most densely packed settlements on earth. In April last year, a cluster of COVID-19 infected people was found in Dharavi, and there was panic in the city. And Dharavi was going to be the next super spreader for COVID-19 because of the density of the settlement pattern, inadequate basic services, lack of health infrastructure, etc. Now, unlike the rest of the country, where the government of India had taken a very top-down approach to dealing with COVID-19, where the pandemic was seen largely as a law and order issue, they realized to deal with this catastrophe in Dharavi, they would have to take a very different approach. So they did a few different things. They partnered with the local community in a meaningful way. And this entailed 3 things. 1, they recruited a cadre of volunteers from local residents, paired them up with members of the municipal corporation who went house to house to survey how bad the situation was. In a place that is marked by mistrust between government agencies and people living in informal settlements, this was the only meaningful way of securing the trust of the local population and ensuring that they could adequately map how bad the situation was. Second, they developed a network of semi-trained, quasi-professional medical practitioners that were operating in Dharavi that have been traditionally ignored by formal health systems. They drew them into a network with government agencies, provided them with the know-how and medicines and other equipment to deal with the crisis, and divided Dharavi into a bunch of sectors that each of these people were then in charge of. Third, they provided financial support to community-based organizations that were located within Dharavi. Specifically, I'll give you one example. They gave financing to one of these organizations to provide personal protective equipment to sanitation workers in this neighborhood, which resulted in not a single sanitation worker in Dharavi contracting COVID-19 up till the time when I was doing research for this. And there are, of course, a whole lot of other examples as well as to how a meaningful partnership with informal actors has been secured across different kinds of risk reduction approaches. Barefoot planners is another good example, modeled roughly along barefoot doctors that were recruited by the government in China to deal with the health problems of the burgeoning rural population in the country. These, again, were semi-trained, quasi-professional practitioners who played a very valuable role in dealing with health crises in the rural areas because they understood the local context, the local culture. They are being used in slum upgradation and slum risk reduction programs across the world. In Swaziland, they recruited community leaders as part of a slum upgradation project that was aimed at reducing the vulnerability and exposure of people living in this informal settlement. And these local leaders actually mediated this process of upgradation and brokered trust between government and local resident, mapped the local area, and ensured that the government really heard and saw what local people wanted. And of course, all these insights are drawn on the work of, giants in this field like David Satterthwaite, who are also, we're lucky to be joined by him in the as part of the audience for this webinar. And I believe, of course, people like Arif Hussain have really led the discourse on this, who are going to be joining this conference in a couple of days. The second pillar of this approach is really predicated on ensuring that urban service delivery systems become more resilient. When it comes to urban development as usual, risk management in these for these urban service delivery systems, transport, health, energy, is limited to contingency planning. There isn't really any sophisticated thinking on resilience that goes on. No attention to modular systems or flexible systems, etc. Now, when it comes to urban resilience as usual, yes, there has been a focus on urban service delivery systems, but there has been an inordinate amount of focus on the hard systems that make up these systems, and less so on the capacity and capability of people running these systems. And there are different ways to argue this point, right? One way is to look at the amount of resources that has gone from international climate funds towards capacity development. First, let's remember, it's only something like 10% of all the money that went from the top 5 climate funds for adaptation went to cities. Of this 10%, 60% was invested in climate proofing transport systems. And at least for one of these funds, the Global Environmental Facility, something like 3% of the total outlay has gone into activities that can be really seen to be developing the capacities and capabilities of people managing these critical urban systems. And therefore, we're arguing that to deal with these kinds of unforeseen risks, it's not enough just to focus on the development of hard systems, protective infrastructure, and climate proofing transport. We need to ensure that people who are running these infra systems can manage these crises adaptively and deal with upheaval as it happens. They need to have the ability to make decisions under uncertainty. And there are a number of different frameworks and approaches out there that support this. Adaptive management is one, where you constantly track the operational environment and tweak the ways in which you run these systems to deal with these changes. Strategic ambiguity is another interesting one that I read about actually in the Harvard Business Review that comes from the field of corporate strategy. It's quite a wide-ranging strategy, but the center point of this is that in long-term plans, like if IBM has a 5-year plan, you build in a ratchet to transition to a short-term planning horizon should crisis strike. So we need to build in these kinds of strategic ratchets for transitions to new planning regimes for dealing with these upheavals. And of course, tactical urbanism is another important one with particular relevance for infra systems. I think many of you would know what tactical urbanism is. This is basically when you do small scale experiments to see what is working with working to deal with emerging problems before investing in permanent solutions. And we saw many of these things happen during COVID-19, right? The opening and closing of public spaces and public transport systems in big cities across the world in concert with the rise and fall of infection rates of COVID-19 is demonstrative of an adaptive management mode of managing infrastructural systems. Now, this was being done reactively. We're arguing that the capacity to do this proactively needs to be built. So we're not firefighting, but we're reducing risk actively. When it comes to tactical urbanism, a whole lot of experiments happened in cities like London and New York during COVID-19, where residents of local neighborhoods painted over bus lanes and made them into bike lanes because there was a dip in public transport use, but a rise in people biking from one place to another. So these are the kinds of innovative experiments that we need to embrace to really build the capacity of people running critical urban systems to deal with disruption and upheaval. The third strategic direction that we emphasize is innovation. When it comes to urban development in the global south, there is very little innovation. Yes, there is some innovation that is rolled largely into big infrastructural projects, but this is expensive, structured, static innovation that follows Eurocentric models of Six Sigma innovation to deliver best possible solutions. When it comes to international development programs focused on enhancing urban resilience, again, there is some emphasis on innovation, but this is led by experts. It's largely ephemeral. You don't have sustainable innovation from 5-year or 3-year projects. And largely these innovations are limited to new ways of managing processes, new ways of bringing governments and citizens together, new ways of participation, etc. So they're a bit kind of, I would argue that it's a shallow approach to innovation for urban resilience. What we're arguing here is that to deal with the kind of disruptive risks that we've described in the earlier part of this presentation, we need a new model of innovation that is frugal, bottom-up, indigenous, and iterative. These forms of innovation already exist. Those of us from South Asia who are listening to this webinar will be familiar with the word jugaad, which is a Hindustani word used across South Asia that connotes a form of innovation that is low cost, iterative, bottom up, and suited to local cultures. And similar models of innovation exist in Kenya, in Brazil, and a whole range of other developing countries, but have largely been ignored by the community of practice working to build urban resilience. We need to recognize the potential of this form of innovation that is led by people who are on the front lines of risk and build an enabling environment to ensure that this innovation is mainstreamed in policy. This can be done in a whole lot of ways. You can have innovation funds, where you challenge funds, where you incentivize frugal innovators for coming up with new kinds of solutions for dealing with risk. You can network frugal innovators with one another to develop an ecosystem that supports frugal innovation. Again, in the time of COVID-19, this kind of innovation suddenly seems to be everywhere. Right? I read an interesting article in Nature that talked about all the shifts in vaccine development protocols that have taken place in order to arrive at COVID-19 vaccine quickly and as efficiently as possible. The fact that regulatory protocols have abridged in a number of countries, the fact that they tried multiple different things at the same time and scaled up the one that showed promise are emblematic of an autonomous innovation mode of innovation, as opposed to the Six Sigma Eurocentric model. So the seeds of people are starting to see the value of this mode of innovation. I've traveled across Vietnam, Bangladesh, and a whole lot of other contexts that are facing a range of hydrometeorological hazards. And there at the community level, you see a number of examples of exciting and autonomous innovations, and one wonders why these are not being recognized and scaled up. In Bangladesh, I remember speaking to a flood-affected community, and one of the biggest problems that they faced from floods was the lack of access to potable water to drinking water. So to remedy this situation, many of them had developed a portable clay stove made from the clay available on the riverbank outside their settlements, which allowed them to boil water and access clean drinking water in times of floods. Now, that single autonomous innovation probably responsible for saving hundreds and thousands of lives, as Bangladesh is a highly flood affected country. Similarly, I saw really interesting roof designs that could help low income urban residents in Da Nang in Vietnam deal with cyclones. So these kinds of innovations are everywhere and need to be scaled up. None of this, of course, is possible with the right kind of finance. So that's our fourth pillar of activity. When it comes to urban development as usual or the business as usual, there's very little finance that goes into cities for actively reducing risk. You know, I talked about the figures a minute ago. Now, there is some finance, of course, that goes from big bilateral, multilateral institutions into cities, but this is slow and static. There is a very high bar to access this. City governments have to demonstrate a lot of capacity to manage the finance that they get from a World Bank or a nation development bank. And so it's difficult for some of the world's riskiest urban contexts to access the limited amount of financing that is available. And any of us who've had the misfortune of dealing with trying to access finance from the international institutions knows that it can be about 5 years from the time you start thinking of an idea to the time the first dollar actually hits your account. So they're really not suited for dealing with these kind of disruptive risks that we've talked about. And therefore, we need a transition to fast and flexible modes of finance that are accessible by cities in the global south and that are calibrated to indigenous needs in cities. And of course, there are a lot of examples here. I'll give you one. I feel that municipal bonds or green municipal bonds are one idea that hasn't been exploited fully. Cities like Cape Town have done this effectively in the recent past and collected quite a lot of money to build new infra systems that reduce risk. Specifically in the case of Cape Town, it was water scarcity. Countries like Indonesia have done this. Recently, they raised $1.5 billion through a green sukuk, which is a Sharia bond through which they've raised a large amount of financing. Interestingly, doing this research, I looked at the regulatory environment for green municipal bonds in countries like India and Bangladesh. There is no legislative or legal barrier to cities issuing municipal bonds and using the proceeds for building resilient infra systems. But there isn't the capacity to do this. I think India has raised a paltry sum of 100 crores, which is something like, I want to say 10 or $15 million. Even less, I think, sorry, ever in the history of the country through municipal bonds. And I think there's a big capacity to do this. Interestingly, again, in the time of COVID-19, we saw the Federal Reserve in America promising to buy $500 million worth of municipal bonds from small and mid-sized cities across the United States to help them with recovering from COVID-19. So there is a lot of potential to this. And of course, there are other methods that we can go into in the question and answers, like land value capture schemes, etc. The final area of action that I want to emphasize here is the importance of data. When it comes to urban development as usual, there is scant or ad hoc use of data on risk. The data that is used is really used for climate proofing infrastructure, which relies on determining the probability of a particular hazard occurring and then developing a piece of infrastructure that is built to withstand a hazard that might occur 1 in 100 years or 1 in 200 years, as we talked about the Hurricane Katrina example. So it's really, not adequate. When it comes to urban resilience programs, yes, they do use downscale climate models, they do surveys, they do participatory approaches to try and understand the vulnerability of a particular area before delivering activities that help reduce risk. But by and large, this data is developed in a centralized way. It's expensive. Surveys can be very expensive. It's arduous. It takes time. It's led by experts. And again, not suited for dealing with the emergent disruptive risks that we talked about earlier. And therefore, we argue that we need a pivot towards new ways of collecting and analyzing data. And specifically, we mean two things. We mean the optimal use of big data technologies that are now showing promise and have been used by a number of actors in cities across the world to reduce risk. But we also mean distributed data approaches where, led by organizations like Slum Dwellers International, where people living in informal settlements survey themselves and make their problems and themselves visible to policy planners who usually ignore what they do. Self-enumeration has been used specifically in the case of understanding local infrastructural needs. For instance, in Namibia, a self-survey of an informal settlement revealed that there was very low water sanitation infrastructure in a particular neighborhood, whereas there was a national policy imperative to provide total sanitation. So making themselves visible and the lack of infrastructure visible through self-enumeration exercises led to the development of water and sanitation infrastructure in this neighborhood. And again, when it comes to big data, we've seen ossified government ministries across the world jump onto the big data bandwagon during COVID-19 through applications like contact tracing. Yes, of course, there are big issues around privacy and the misuse of data gathered through big data approaches. And it's certainly not a silver bullet, but we feel that it shows promise, and in the right kind of policy environment with the right controls in place can really help understand the risk and resilience needs of a particular city. Happy to go into a whole number of examples and applications of how big data might help in reducing risk. So that's the sum total of my argument. I welcome your question. I am going to end by making a cheap plug for a paper that captures these ideas. Please just type in disruptive resilience and IIED. It will pop up on Google. This has all the references to all the arguments that I've presented here, and to my book that explores each of these things in much more detail. We have a 10,000-word chapter on each of the 5 things that I presented here. Please do look out for it in July 2021. I'll stop there and hand back to Deliana. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening to me today.
Thank you very, very much, Aditya, and indeed, fascinating presentation, fascinating linkages and thoughts. I do think we've got quite a few questions in the chat box and in the Q&A. But before I turn to, oh my gosh, and there's more and more coming, before I turn to those, and I promised myself I wouldn't be doing that, but I'm going to do it regardless. I'm going to start with my own questions. And I've got one smallish one for Kathryn and one possibly slightly bigger one for Aditya. When you spoke about the choice that people have to make about whether they would be paying for food or paying for utilities, and you said that this is a kind of violence, and maybe you didn't say that, maybe that was my my interpretation of what you said. I wonder whether you would be able to position this financialization of infrastructure on this gradient of Galton's notion of violence between direct violence and structural violence somewhere. Is it structural violence or is it direct violence? Because I guess it comes with a question of whether we can hold accountable who is in charge of this, who is responsible for this, and who can be, well, again, made accountable for the violence inflicted upon an entire population, basically, of infrastructure users. So I'm slightly obsessed with violence at the moment. So I would really welcome your thoughts on this. And Aditya, okay, I guess the smaller question, and I will keep the bigger one for later. But how do we make services and systems resilient when they are not available in the first place? How do we make India's Mumbai slums resilient, where people do not have access to tap water in the first instance, where do not have access to sanitation in the first instance, where even any kind of traditional service network sanitation is not in place? So what is the approach to resilience there, and how do we interpret this? And building on that, you spoke about adaptive management, or even agile governance, or whatever you want to call it. But I know they're different things, but how do we implement this in practice? What kind of training is needed for policymakers, municipalities, practitioners? Because from my experience working with municipalities in many places in the global South, the training is basic. It is very basic. It is very siloed. It is very much a framework that is being adapted without further questioning. That is very traditional, very conventional, conservative, if you like. So how do you change that? Where do you start? Where do you train? How do you train? And how do you make possible this type of more complex version of governance or management? And I'm gonna turn myself off now, and I'm gonna let you speak, whoever decides, maybe Kathryn first, and then Aditya. And meanwhile, I'm gonna collect questions from the audience. Before we do that, may I just say, if you just indicate that you have a question, apparently what I can do here is to let you speak. So if you just raise your hand or put in the chat that you want to say something as a member of the audience, then I have a way of letting you speak and ask your question directly rather than reading it out. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Liliana, for the question. I think that's an interesting question. I have to say I'm not familiar with Galton's, I guess, panorama of violence, but I would say, just on a guess of what structural violence or direct violence means, I think it's pretty obvious. I would say that it involves both, right? And so one of the things I think that's important in these sorts of relationships, right, is how, as a society, right, so we can talk about the utility, we can talk about the funding bodies, or the banks, if you will, but we can also talk about how collectively as a society we've been conditioned to think about debt, right? And debt very much as an individual responsibility. And so in Medellin, and so as an individual responsibility also, that says something about you as an individual if you become indebted, right? So you have poorly managed your finances, you are irresponsible, there's something vaguely degenerate about your behavior, and therefore you deserve this situation, and you should, pull up your socks and get your way out of it. And so there's this thing in Margaret Atwood's book where she says, in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, so the words for debt and sin are the same. And this is actually true in Swedish, for example. I think it's also true in German. It's true in Dutch. And so in many languages, the equation between debt and sin is preserved, right? And we can even think, like, in English or whatever, we talk about paying your debt to society, when you're in prison. So these ideas of debt and what's owed and to whom are very prevalent in society, and they're very moralized, right? Against those who owe, towards those who collect. And so I think this rethinking these kinds of assumptions about being in debt and what that means, and what is therefore expected of you and can be extracted from you, need to be rethought more broadly on a societal kind of level. We need new ways of thinking about these sorts of relationships, right? And so, for example, in the case of Medellin, users that become indebted to the utility, we have ideas of good and bad users, right? So we don't have ideas of affordability and unaffordability. We have ideas of good and bad users. And a good user is somebody that will make sure they pay their utility bills above all and not go into debt, because debt is a sin, right? And will withhold food from themselves and their family in order to accomplish that, right? And so debt is also about sacrifice, right? What sacrifices are you willing to make to pay the piper, right? And so these are larger ideologies in society that produce this kind of violence, that justify this kind of violence, and let it be thought of as really not a violence. It's like a situation you have ended up in, and you should have been more responsible. And so I think this is one of the first, say, culprits or actors of violence, or that allows this kind of violence to be justified. And so in this sense, like around the financing model, I think there are actors involved in this, right? And so when we think about Laura Baer's comment or analysis of neoliberalism, that it's actually about debt. It's not about some kind of ideology about, you know, government and markets and how they should be related. And if you have more markets, you'll have better government and blah, blah, blah. No, it's about debt collection, right? And so we've developed an ideology called neoliberalism, right? That pretends to be about a relationship between government and the market, such as it is, if there is a market. And then, but it's actually about debt collection, right? And if we look really at structural adjustment, if we look at neoliberal policies like full cost recovery, what do we see as a mechanism of debt collection, right? And so I think that driving these policies actually does have actors, right? And so this can be thought of as a violent measure, because in countries in Latin America, in the global South, or in countries of the North as well, although this debt is extracted through taxes, through austerity, through user fees, increase in user fees from the population in general, those who pay dearest are the most vulnerable in society, right? The lowest income people who will lose their jobs, lose their access to education for their children and themselves, lose access to healthcare, right? Through austerity and government retrenchment, which is necessary to pay your debts, right? And so the debt relation becomes a justification for all kinds of violences, whether they're structural, but I would say they're certainly often felt directly, right? Like if you're going hungry, if you're cooking on an open fire and getting lung conditions and burns, then these are all directly felt violence as well.
Should I?
Go ahead, Aditya. Plenty to discuss there.
Yeah, Delena, thank you for the easy question of asking me how informal settlements can get basic services across the world. Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, there are no easy answers, of course, right? That's the first response. Second thing is we need to recognize, and governments need to recognize, that the provision of basic services has a direct link to resilience. You know, really interesting impact evaluation study of flood affected communities in Pakistan. Those that had good access to basic services before the flood were able to bounce back much faster than those that did not. So I think the first is acknowledging the link between infrastructure and resilience. Second is to also acknowledge that delivering infrastructure in a top-down fashion without understanding local context and culture has never really delivered impact. So if the government is going to go and build 1,000 toilets or whatever, a billion toilets or whatever the government of India is doing, is laudable, of course, because their heart is in the right place there. But the use of those toilets for across all studies is questionable because there hasn't been that kind of engagement of the communities. And that's just one small and silly example to demonstrate the point. Other much more substantial examples, like the Orangi pilot project, where communities played an active role in bridging local infrastructure deficits, empowered to do so, have demonstrated potential beyond. So I think those are the few things to answer that point on the provision of infrastructure. I think your point on capacity gaps in urban local bodies, municipalities is well taken, and they're not easy to plug, but I certainly think there are now enough examples from around the world that demonstrate how it can be done. And in this book, we argue that we need to look at capacity building as a three-layered cake. We need to develop institutional incentives for to create an enabling environment for this to take place. Let me give you one example of an institutional incentive from India that I can guarantee is going to deliver very rich dividends a few years down the line. So India is a federal country, and the government collects federal revenue, and then the states collect some taxes for themselves. And there's a complicated formula through which the federal government shares resources with provincial or state governments. There are a number of parameters, performance-based indicators, that determine how much of a share of central resources a state should get. For instance, if the forest cover goes up, then the states get a little more of a share. You know, if they meet the education targets, their health targets, they get more of a share. As of last year, risk reduction has become one of those performance-based indicators in sharing the finances between the center and the states that really incentivizes local level subnational action to ensure that risk management becomes a priority. So that is really at the broadest level, the first ratchet for enhancing capacities. The second layer of the cake is developing organizational capacity. So you need to look at organizations, say a municipal corporation. You need to embed the importance of risk and resilience within its charter, within its mandate, within the terms of reference of individual peoples. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Personally, a part of my research was based on a town on the Indo-Nepal border called Gorakhpur, a tiny Indian town of just about 1 million residents, where there were big deficits in governance, let alone adaptation and resilience. And here, through an international development project, basically, what the project did was mobilize local communities to exert pressure on the town's municipal corporation to really think about issues of risk and resilience much more seriously. For the first time in the history of the city, vulnerable residents and municipal commissioners came together around the same table to discuss the problems of flooding, and other climate impacts. That paved the way for the joint development of a city resilience strategy that was formally adopted by the government. That then paved the way for a whole number of small things that made a big impact in the lives of people. For example, rebuilding drains in low-lying areas of the city, activating unused water storage tanks that the municipal corporation had built but never really used because of various reasons. So in this way, organizational capacity at a city level was increased by increasing accountability from below. And the third layer of the cake is really building individual capacities, working with your junior engineers and people running these systems to really make them understand what are the standards and practices that they need to follow in order to manage risk or manage systems adaptively. And again, there are examples around the world that show the pathway for how this can be done. And I think city-to-city twinning has demonstrated interesting potential through networks like ICLEI and UCLG, where cities that are starting their resilience journey and cities that are ahead in the resilience journey have spoken to each other, where people, a junior engineer in the Gorakhpur Municipal Corporation can speak to a junior engineer in the Rotterdam government and exchange lessons and insights. Those kinds of experiments are starting to show promise and need to be scaled up. Apart from, of course, the usual didactic approaches where universities might give trainings to members of municipal corporations, etc. I'll stop there.
There's a healthy dose of optimism there, I think. But I appreciate that, and I look forward to the book actually and reading more about those propositions. I shall let the people speak now. Let's see if I can actually manage to do that. Norma, is Norma still around? Norma, I think you had a comment or a question for Kathryn, so I'm gonna. Norma? Maybe it's not, yeah, there it is. Okay.
Oh, hi. Congratulations, Kathryn and Aditya. Your both presentation was pretty amazing. I have a little concern in terms of the content of Kathryn and Aditya share with us. is about the role of the institutions in the American context, particularly in terms of the actual crisis in Brazil. In Brazil, here in Brazil, the public debt is huge, it's tremendous, but the political and environmental crises are huge too. So here we have a match of different types of crises, and it results in an institutional instability. My question for both Kathryn and Aditya is about it. Institutions, in my opinion, public institutions, in my opinion, are not just looking for new models in terms of infrastructures in sanitation or energy for everyone's development. Institutions are capturing by the small groups of power. In terms of this, the new models of development is a difficult task that we have to deal. So in a view of a dirt political game, the violence and the corruption must always be in the equation. So I would like to hear you about this complex game in terms of the orientation of the new models of sanitation and the new models of the reduction of risk, the risk reduction policies. Please, Kathryn and Aditya, I'm grateful to hear you about this particular aspect. Thank you, Deliana, too.
I guess I could go first. Thanks very much for your question, Norma. I think it's a really important question. Very interesting and super pertinent. And of course, as you rightly point out, yeah, I mean, it's not like all the leaders in any country, and certainly in Colombia as well, are working for the greater good of all the people in the country all the time. So obviously, corruption, back dealing, and as pointed out in your comment to me, often you will get elites on, directions of organizations like the World Bank even, or the Inter-American Development Bank, that are also pushing these same policies that will lead to this kind of wealth extraction that I was talking about. So these are very valid points. And I think one of the things that makes the Medellin case particularly important is that this continues to be considered. And of course, there have been scandals over time related to corruption. There's a big one going on right now around a major dam development. But in the grand scheme of things, it's considered, certainly by organizations like the IMF and the World Bank that do their fair share of assessments and pointing the finger, that it is a well-managed kind of poster boy sort of utility in Latin America model to be followed. And the point is that even when, and I'm not saying that everything is perfect, but even when you follow the rules, right? You're the good student, you're this sort of person that pays their debts no matter what, you're still in this situation, right? You're still in this situation where you have connections to services, but massive disconnections for an inability to pay. You have skyrocketing utility rates to deal with the debt problem, right? And so I guess the point is, in this context, is because this is what I guess I find, and I'm not saying that governance problems don't exist, right? That there's not back dealing, there's not corruption, all this kind of stuff. But what I am saying is that when the focus is on those problems, it's not on other more structural problems that are also causing a lot of pain, right? So what I find is that in a lot of discussions around utilities, particularly in the global south, the blame is always on the utility. Now, I'm not saying that these are all well managed and there's not back dealing and all this kind of stuff, but that means that this relation, right, of wealth extraction does not need to be examined. We're always examining the ability to comply, right? The ability to do good governance, which has come more and more to mean this sort of financial neoliberal model of governance. And so what I'm trying to point out is that even in an apparently best case scenario of utility governance, which is certainly not perfect, you do end up in this relation of incredible wealth extraction and borrowing to meet debt, right? Huge infrastructure constructions to meet debt, right? Because it's almost impossible to meet because of devaluation, because of interest rates, because of fees on debt. Like even, and the thing is, irrespective of corruption, they're in this relationship from their very first loan, right? And the thing that I would say also in the Medellin case, and of course I haven't studied Brazil, is that this is also not a monolith, right? So that there are debates and struggles around utility governance, around politics in Colombia, in Latin American countries. So a woman who's at Utrecht University, Tatiana Acevedo, what she points out is often in sort of political ecology approaches, so which are Marxist, towards Latin America and in geography and stuff, the discussion of power is this kind of monolith sort of thing, right? And this politics as vying for position between political parties, which can actually be very vibrant in the Latin American context, is washed aside. And a change in government can lead to significant changes, right? And this also has to do maybe with other structural characteristics. So it does matter, for example, and I mean, you can certainly correct and know better than I do, but it matters now in Brazil that Bolsonaro is in charge and not Dilma, Lula, et cetera. And so that although there is these widespread problems, there are also significant debates and struggles over those problems among different kinds of political actors. And that I would say what the Medellin case shows, just to repeat myself, is that even in what the World Bank or the IMF would identify as the best case scenario, this extractiveness of debt still happens, is still extremely difficult to control, right? And so that's, so it's basically the point. The point is not to deny the importance of backdealing, corruption, extreme inequality, not at all. Thank you for the question.
So I thought 2 hours would be plenty of time. 90 minutes would be plenty of time. It appears it is absolutely not. I understand Aditya has to leave now, so I would unfortunately, we do have plenty of questions for Aditya here, but unfortunately we will have to answer them in other ways. We'll find ways to do that. So Aditya, thank you very, very much for joining us today and for being here with us today. And yeah, we'll follow up on some of the questions that have been posed here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm sorry I have to cut this short.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Kathryn, I don't know if you have a few more minutes or.
Sure. Yeah. No,
yeah.
No problem. Yeah.
So if we, let me just quickly go through the many questions that we have, or if someone wants to ask questions for Kathryn, if you could please raise your hand at this point. Let me just see if we have any raised hands. Doesn't appear. I know that there were questions about practical things, about the one. Susan is asking about the author of the essay that you mentioned from representing class.
The name of the author is, oh, sorry, I think, oh, yeah, is Carol, Carole, Biewener, Biewener.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, Carol, with an
Carol.
E at the end. And then Biewener, or Biewener, Biewener.
I tried.
That's perfect. That's exactly correct.
Perfect. So that
correct.
was one minor question answered. And then there we have a hand raised. Let me just find who it is. David. Unmute yourself, David. You should be able to speak now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant to have you here, David.
Well, it was a wonderful session.
Thanks for coming.
I've got a story for Kathryn, which comes from Karachi.
Okay.
And the government was negotiating a $60 million loan from the Asian Development Bank and had to pay a $20 million contribution for themselves. Now, Arif Hassan and his team said, the job's only going to cost you $20 million, so ignore the loan from the Asian Development Bank. Do the work with the contribution you would have had to make already, and everyone will be fine, except the Asian Development Bank that was absolutely furious. The other thing, just to point out to you, my doctorate was a very long time ago, but it was interviewing with staff from all the big international agencies, well, not all of them. And I'm reminded, when I was at the bank, someone took me aside and said, you know, the two critical variables that we map for every project, staff costs and time to finish. There were no development implications. And sometimes we forget that the bank operates as a bank. It has all sorts of nice frilly talk on the side, but in the end, it's just as much a bank as a private bank.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you very much for those comments. And I read a book actually from the 1980s. It's published in 1980, and it goes through the World Bank. It's actually quite positive towards the World Bank. But one of the things that the author does talk about is this thing that happened in Medellin where you cut off loans in order to ensure compliance was actually quite frequent, but it was more the threat, and then you would get compliance. So you rarely needed to go as far as to cut payments or to suspend payments to achieve compliance, and on things like pricing.
All right. Thank you, David. Do we have more hands? I can't see any more hands. I think we've covered most of the commentary in the chat. Well, at that point, slightly overrun, half an hour longer than we were supposed to take. I would like to thank everyone for attending. I think it was an absolutely fascinating session with very interesting thoughts to take in and to think further. And I look forward to the forthcoming conversations. For the audience, again, just to mention, this is just the launch of a series of about 15 sessions such as this one over the next 15 weeks. So please do visit the website, please do sign up. We will make the video of this, the recording, available on the website. So if you do want to revisit, please find it, and we may send an email as well once this is up and running. So thank you very, very much to Kathryn for this brilliant talk today. Thank you for everyone, to everyone for their questions, and hopefully see you next week for the session on East Asia, which will have talks on China, on Mongolia, on infrastructures of play and energy and sanitation. And I look forward to seeing everyone again next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.